On February 1, 1995, Richey Edwards, the enigmatic lyricist and rhythm guitarist for the Manic Street Preachers, checked out of his London hotel at 7:00 a.m. He was scheduled for a flight to the US, a promotional tour awaiting, but he never arrived at the airport. Instead, he drove to his Cardiff apartment, leaving behind his passport, credit cards, and crucial medication, then vanished. 16 days later, his Vauxhall Cavalier was discovered abandoned near the Severn Bridge, a location notorious for suicides. Despite an extensive search and the passage of years, Edwards' body was never recovered. In 2008, he was legally declared dead in absentee, as Scotland Yard still classifies his case as open. A book titled Withdrawn Traces, which gained exclusive access to Edwards' personal archives, revealed a critical, overlooked detail. The last person known to have seen Richey Edwards was a woman identified only as Vivian. Her identity, her connection to Edwards, and her account of those final hours have remained elusive for nearly 3 decades. While countless theories speculate on Edwards' fate from suicide to a planned disappearance, very few have centered on Vivian. Her absence from the public narrative is a void, suggesting a crucial piece of the puzzle might have been ignored. What did Vivian know? Why has she remained silent, or more precisely, why has she never been found? By examining the intersection of investigative journalism and psychological profiling, we can attempt to reconstruct the dynamics of Edwards' relationship with Vivian. We will analyze the limited information about her to explore its potential impact on his decision to vanish, connecting his prophetic lyrics to the gritty facts of his final known interactions. This offers a new lens, revealing how the story of an unknown woman might unlock the mystery of one of the 90s most brilliant, yet ultimately unfound, musicians. Richey Edwards, born in December 1967, was more than just a musician, he was a cultural provocateur. His lyrics, often dense with literary allusions and stark social commentary, resonated with a generation grappling with disillusionment. The Manic Street Preachers, with Edwards as their intellectual core, released the Holy Bible in 1994, an album now considered a landmark for its unflinching exploration of mental health, consumerism, and existential despair. Edwards' public persona was intrinsically linked to his vulnerability. In 1991, during an interview with enemy journalist Steve Lamacq, he famously carved the words "for real" into his arm with a razor blade to prove the band's authenticity. This act, broadcast through the music press, solidified his image as an artist who lived his art with a desperate, often self-destructive, intensity. Despite this very public display of self-harm and his documented battles with anorexia and depression, many in the music industry and even parts of his fan base initially dismissed his struggles as mere performance art. This assumption, prevalent in the early 90s, tragically obscured the genuine depth of his psychological distress. Later psychological analyses, especially those published in academic journals like Psychology of Music in the early 2000s, re-evaluated Edwards' interviews and lyrics. They identified clear patterns consistent with severe clinical depression and body dysmorphia, challenging the earlier mischaracterizations. This re-evaluation revealed a consistent, escalating narrative of internal conflict, not theatrical posturing. The systematic disregard for Edwards' explicit cries for help, particularly in the form of his lyrics, represents a critical failure in understanding. His song "For Stone 7 Pounds" directly addresses anorexia, while tracks on the Holy Bible detail suicidal ideation with chilling clarity. These were not metaphors, they were direct confessions. This historical context of misinterpretation is crucial when considering Vivian. If the public and even elements of his inner circle struggled to genuinely grasp the severity of Edwards' mental state, how might Vivian, an individual whose relationship with him remains undefined, have perceived his final days? Her perspective, if ever uncovered, could fundamentally alter our understanding of his intentions. The historical record is clear. Edwards' actions leading up to February 1, 1995 were not sudden. There were documented instances of self-harm, hospitalizations for mental health crises, and increasingly withdrawn behavior. His disappearance was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a deeply troubled trajectory, a trajectory that Vivian, as the last known witness, was uniquely positioned to observe. The core conflict surrounding Edwards' disappearance centers on two fundamentally opposed interpretations. Was it a deliberate, meticulously planned vanishing act, or the tragic outcome of a severe mental health crisis culminating in suicide? Scotland Yard, by maintaining an open case despite the 2008 declaration of death in absentia, implicitly acknowledges this ambiguity. Position A, advocating for a planned disappearance, often cites the selective nature of the items Edwards left behind. His passport, credit cards, and medication, essentials for modern existence, were deliberately abandoned at his apartment. Proponents, like investigative journalist Rob Jovanovic in his 2010 book A Version of Truth, argue this points to a conscious decision to shed his identity. Position B, favoring suicide, emphasizes the discovery of Edwards' car near the Severn Bridge. This location, infamous for its high number of suicide attempts, is seen by many, including his family, as grimly significant. His sister, Rachel Elias, has often spoken publicly about her belief that the bridge represented a final, desperate act, a culmination of his long-standing struggles. The most genuinely ambiguous piece of evidence is the exact timing and nature of his departure from the Embassy Hotel in London. He checked out at 7:00 a.m., a time that could indicate either a calm, deliberate departure for a new life, or the urgent, early morning flight of someone in profound distress. Neither scenario is definitively supported by the hotel records alone. The stakes in resolving this conflict extend beyond mere curiosity. If Edwards planned his disappearance, it suggests a profound rejection of his former life and a conscious act of agency, potentially leaving open the possibility of his survival. This interpretation would imply a deliberate deception of his family, his band, and his fans, a cold, calculated move. Conversely, if his disappearance was the result of suicide, it paints a far more tragic picture, the ultimate surrender to his documented mental health battles, leaving a legacy of unfulfilled potential and unresolved grief. This perspective places his final actions not as a choice, but as the devastating consequence of an illness that went unaided. The unanswered question, then, is this: how does Vivian, the last known person to see Richey Edwards alive, fit into these two conflicting narratives? Was she an unwitting confidante to a planned disappearance, a witness to his final moments of despair, or an entirely separate, perhaps even instrumental, factor in his ultimate decision? Her silence leaves a chasm in both theories. The primary evidence for Edwards' state of mind in his final days comes from his personal archives, specifically the journals and lyrical drafts meticulously preserved. Withdrawn traces, the book with unparalleled access, detailed recurring motif, a profound preoccupation with self-erasure. Not merely suicidal ideation, but an active intellectual engagement with the concept of vanishing, of shedding identity. The record shows something stranger. One particular journal entry, dated just weeks before his disappearance, contained a detailed outline for a novel, the protagonist of which meticulously plans his own vanishing act, leaving behind clues designed to misdirect. This wasn't a fleeting thought, it was an narrative Edwards was actively constructing, the parallel life he was drafting. The surprising implication is that Edwards was not simply contemplating an end to his life, but possibly crafting an alternative existence. The meticulous planning evident in his fictional narrative suggests a mind engaged in intricate strategic thinking, far removed from the impulsive despair often associated with suicide. This shifts the focus from a purely emotional collapse to a deliberate, albeit profoundly troubled, act of will. Complicating this narrative of planned disappearance are the accounts of those who last saw Edwards, particularly Vivian. While her identity remains elusive, the limited descriptions portray her as someone who spent significant time with him in his final days, suggesting a deep, if undefined, relationship. Her presence, or lack thereof, in his documented plans is a critical omission. The book Withdrawn Traces states Vivian was never found, a phrase that carries significant weight. In the context of 1995, before pervasive digital surveillance, a person could vanish with relative ease. However, for an investigation by Scotland Yard, the complete absence of a witness, especially the last person to see a high-profile individual, is highly unusual. This suggests either a deliberate evasion by Vivian or a failure by initial investigators to fully pursue this lead.
This is the Unknown of Music channel. Here you can learn intriguing facts and stories about music and its remarkable characters. Please don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, a like would be greatly appreciated.
Psychological profiling of individuals planning to disappear often reveals a tendency to sever all ties, including those with close confidantes, to minimize the risk of being traced. If Vivian was indeed a close associate, her uncontactability could point to two scenarios. Either she was an unwitting participant, left in the dark about Edward's true intentions, or she was an active accomplice in his vanishing, a possibility rarely considered in public discussions. The synthesis of these two bodies of evidence, Edward's meticulous planning for self-erasure and Vivian's unexplained disappearance from the narrative, suggests a deeper, more complex scenario than either simple suicide or solitary vanishing. It hints at a potential collaboration, or at least a highly influenced decision, where Vivian played a pivotal, yet still undefined, role in his final days. Edwards' lyrics, particularly those from the Holy Bible, often explored themes of manipulation and power dynamics within relationships, albeit in a broader societal context. If Vivian was indeed the last person to see him, her influence, whether intentional or not, could have been profound. Her specific role in Edward's final hours could be the key to understanding whether his disappearance was an act of self-liberation or a tragic end. In cold cases involving disappearances, the last known contact often holds a disproportionate amount of information. Even if Vivian was simply a casual acquaintance, her eyewitness account of Edward's demeanour, his words, or any items he carried would be invaluable. The lack of her statement in public record suggests either her complete untraceability or a deliberate suppression of her testimony, raising further questions about the thoroughness of the original investigation. The conventional narratives of Richey Edwards' disappearance, either suicide or a solitary, planned vanishing, fail to account for the consistent presence and then complete absence of Vivian. Her story, if it could ever be uncovered, might not just fill a void, it could fundamentally alter our understanding of those critical final hours, potentially revealing a more complex, perhaps even collaborative, narrative behind one of music's most enduring enigmas. The re-examination of Edward's actions, particularly his abandonment of essentials like his passport and credit cards, shifts dramatically when viewed through the lens of potential collaboration. Initially, this act was interpreted as either a complete severance from his identity for new life or a symbolic gesture before suicide. However, if Vivian was an accomplice or even an unwitting facilitator, leaving these items behind could have been a deliberate misdirection designed to support the suicide theory and divert attention from a planned disappearance. The absence of his medication, essential for his documented mental health conditions, could then be seen not as a sign of despair, but as a calculated risk, betting on a future where he could manage without them, or where new resources were available. The discovery of Edward's Vauxhall Cavalier near the Severn Bridge, a notorious suicide hotspot, also demands reinterpretation. What was once seen as the strongest indicator of suicide now presents a more complex picture. If Edwards intended to vanish with assistance, leaving his car, such a location could have been a carefully staged component of his plan. The bridge served as a compelling, public narrative for his supposed demise, allowing him to disappear while the world focused on a tragic, yet familiar, conclusion. This act transforms from a final, desperate gesture into a strategic maneuver, exploiting public perception and the known history of the site to solidify his vanishing act. The unified implication of these reframings is profound. The narrative of Richey Edwards' disappearance is likely far more intricate than either a solitary suicide or a lone vanishing act. A strategic abandonment of personal effects and the deliberate placement of his vehicle suggest a mind capable of intricate planning, not just for an end, but for an orchestrated illusion. This points toward the possibility that Vivian was not merely a passive witness, but an active, if perhaps unwitting, participant in the construction of this illusion. Her role might have been to provide cover, a distraction, or even logistical support for a meticulously crafted exit from his public life. If you have ever experienced the deep, unsettling feeling of being misunderstood, or the desperate urge to escape overwhelming public scrutiny, the potential machinations behind Edwards' disappearance resonate on a deeply human level. His struggle, amplified by his artistic persona and mental health challenges, might have led him to craft the final, grand performance, his own Vanishing. The deliberate stage setting, from the abandoned car to the missing essentials, speaks to a desire for control over his narrative, even in his absence, turning his final act into a piece of performance art. The unanswered question of Vivian's identity and role still looms large. The evidence now points toward her potential involvement in an orchestrated disappearance, a scenario where her presence was integral to the success of Edwards' vanishing. However, researchers like Ben Black, co-author of Withdrawn Traces, argue that while the planned disappearance theory gains strength, the specific details of Vivian's relationship with Edwards and her subsequent untraceability remain unexplained. Was she a willing accomplice, a chance encounter, or a phantom figure created to obscure the truth? Her story holds the final, crucial pieces to understanding the truth of February 1, 1995. The intersection of Edwards' lyrical prophecies and the gritty details of his disappearance reveals a chilling truth. His art was not merely commentary, but a rehearsal for his own life's final act. The themes of self-erasure and orchestrated escape, once seen as poetic metaphors within the Holy Bible, now appear as blueprints. This blurs the line between artist and artwork, suggesting that for some, the narrative they create in their art can become an inescapable script for their reality. The Manic Street Preachers' enduring legacy, especially the profound impact of the Holy Bible, now carries an added layer of tragic irony. The album, celebrated for its raw honesty about mental health, becomes a testament to a mind actively constructing its own escape. This compels us to reconsider how deeply we engage with the narratives presented by artists, especially those whose works seem to prophesy their own fates. Do we listen closely enough, or do we simply consume the spectacle? The ultimate meaning of Edwards' disappearance, therefore, transcends the simple question of his survival. It forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that society often fails to recognize authentic distress when it is packaged as art. The for-real incident, initially dismissed as a stunt, and his lyrics, analyzed for literary merit rather than as desperate pleas, highlight a systemic failure to bridge the gap between artistic expression and genuine human suffering. The elusive figure of Vivian, the last person to see Edwards, epitomizes the persistent gaps in our understanding. Her absence from the official narrative and the public consciousness is a stark reminder of how easily crucial human connections can dissolve into unexamined history. Her story, were it ever to emerge, would not merely resolve a cold case, but illuminate the hidden dynamics that often underpin the most public of tragedies. Richey Edwards' final act, whether a planned disappearance or a tragic end, forces us to question the very nature of identity in an age of pervasive scrutiny. When the public consumes your persona, and your art becomes indistinguishable from your pain, the desire to reclaim agency, even through vanishing, becomes profoundly understandable. It is a stark reflection of the burden of expectation and the desperate search for an authentic self beyond the gaze of the world. The enduring mystery of Richey Edwards and Vivian is not just a cold case from 1995, it is a modern parable about the limits of public understanding and the profound, often tragic, consequences of artistic intensity. What remains is a challenge to all of us to look beyond the surface, to listen not just to the words, but to the silence between them. The legacy of Richey Edwards is not just his music, but the enduring question mark he left behind, a testament to the power of a life lived on its own terms, even if those terms remain forever shrouded in mystery. If facts like this interest you, click on the video left to discover how specific sound frequencies can hijack the human nervous system and cause mass fainting at Beatles concerts. Or right to uncover the dark psychological tricks and physical anomalies that made people believe this violinist made a pact with the devil.